Hello everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the key events of the early Cold War, focusing on events from 1946 to 1960. By the end of the video, you should be able to define the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. You should be able to explain why Germany split into two separate nations in 1949. You should be able to define Mao Zedong, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. And you should be able to describe the causes, course, and significance of the Korean War. To get started, we need to look at the competition between the USA and the USSR in Europe, because without understanding this, we can't understand why Germany gets split up. So basically, at the end of World War II, neither side trusts one another. The USA believes that the USSR is committed to world revolution, while the USSR views the USA as imperialist and believes that the United States wants to expand capitalism as far east as possible. So because neither side trusts the other, both sides try to carve out spheres of influence in Europe. The United States does this by giving military and economic assistance to Western Europe in order to help create capitalist democracies. The two foundations of the U.S. strategy are the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine is the strategy of propping up nations that are, quote, threatened by communist takeovers by giving them military assistance. This happens most notably in Greece and Turkey in the early 1950s. And the Marshall Plan is where the United States gives economic assistance to countries in order to make their economies grow and to basically fight communism by making capitalism seem really awesome. The USSR also carves out a sphere of influence, but it doesn't really have very much economic assistance to give to countries since its economy was hurt by World War II, but instead it installs by force Soviet-style governments in Eastern Europe. So you get basically two spheres of influence. In Western Europe, America is in control, and in Eastern Europe, the USSR is in control. But conflict emerges in Germany because both sides occupy parts of Germany. What this ultimately results in is the division of Germany into two separate countries. So where this starts is that after World War II, when Germany surrenders unconditionally, Germany is occupied by Russian, British, French, and US forces. So Germany is divided up into four separate zones, as you can see in that map there. And importantly, the city of Berlin, which is well inside the Soviet zone, is also divided up into Russian, English, French, and American zones. So the original plan here was that Germany would be occupied for a little while, but then would go back to being a single unified nation. But this was difficult because each side had different plans for what sort of nation Germany should become. The USA wanted Germany to become a capitalist democracy, while the USSR wanted Germany to become a Soviet-style communist nation. And so obviously this isn't going to work out. So in 1948, Britain, France, and the United States go ahead and decide to form their three zones into a single independent capitalist nation. Basically, they form West Germany. The USSR is not happy about this because they hope to turn all of Germany into a Soviet-style state. And so in response, the USSR establishes something known as the Berlin Blockade, where they try to gain control of the entire city of Berlin. And they do this by cutting off all supplies and travel between Berlin and West Germany, hoping that the Western powers will give up their control of Berlin. But rather than giving up control of Berlin, the United States instead establishes something called the Berlin Airlift. In the Berlin Airlift, what they do is they use old World War II bombers to supply Berlin with food and other necessities until Russia decides to end the blockade in 1949. So basically, for like a good number of months, the USA bombs Berlin with food and supplies until the USSR gives up. After this, the USSR decides to form East Germany in 1949, and East Germany is a Soviet-style communist state. So we see two Germanys emerging, a communist East Germany and a capitalist West Germany. And this is one of the first open conflicts between the United States and the USSR and kind of kicks off the Cold War. Here's a picture from the Berlin airlift. This is a US plane bringing in supplies, and people in Berlin are waiting eagerly to get these supplies because basic necessities like food and medicine are in very short supply in Berlin during the Soviet blockade. Another important event that influences the early course of the Cold War was the emergence of China as a communist nation. The roots of this stem back to the very end of World War II, where there is a Chinese civil war going on between two groups. The two groups are the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists support turning China into a sort of Western-aligned free market economy, and the United States backs the nationalists. The communists want to set up a Marxist state in China, and they win support of millions of Chinese peasants because they promise to give free land to these peasants. In 1949, the communists, who are led by Mao Zedong, win the war. In 1950, China goes on to establish a pact of friendship with the USSR. And to American observers, this looks like communism spreading. It's basically Harry Truman's worst nightmare. It looks as if communism has spread to China, and it seems like it's only a matter of time until communism spreads to the rest of Asia. Many Americans imagine that there was some sort of unification between the USSR and Communist China, when in fact they were independent nations pursuing independent goals. But in 1950, China did establish a pact of friendship with the USSR, and these guys become close allies for the next 20 or so years. In 1955, Mao Zedong decides to attempt to modernize China very quickly in the same way that Stalin very quickly modernized Russia in the 1920s and 30s. This attempt is called the Great Leap Forward. And the backbone of the Great Leap Forward is by establishing collective agriculture and also to try to rapidly develop industry. This plan fails, and collective agriculture does not produce as much as was hoped, and it results in the deaths of 15 million people because of a famine that occurs because of the disruption due to collective agriculture. But Mao Zedong is not done with his attempts at reforming Chinese culture, and he, in 1966, launches the Cultural Revolution. The full name of this is the Great Revolution to Establish a Proletarian Culture. And the idea here is Mao Zedong wants to reshape the culture of China to make it fit better with Marxist ideas. And so what they do here is they attempt to eliminate traditional Chinese beliefs and cultural practices and to replace these with communist ideas, including ideas of progress and selfless sacrifice for the good of the community. One final event that we're going to look at today is the Korean War. And the Korean War is important because it is one of the first, it is the first major proxy war between US and USSR forces. So after World War II, Japan was occupied by the USA, and Korea was split along a north-south axis, or I guess an east-west axis. They split into North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is controlled by the USSR, and South Korea is controlled by the United States. And they are divided along a line known as the 38th parallel. In 1948, both sides set up independent governments. The USSR sets up a communist nation in North Korea, and the United States sets up a capitalist nation in South Korea. There's a lot of tension and aggression between these two countries, both of which want to unify Korea under their government. There are a lot of clashes along the 38th parallel, and recent research has showed that most of these clashes were actually caused by South Korea. In response to these clashes, and also just because they want to unite the country, North Korea decides to invade South Korea. And so the North Korean leader, Kim Il-sung, the granddaddy of Kim Jong-un, who is the current dictator of North Korea, convinces China and Russia to back an invasion of South Korea. With backing from China and Russia, North Korea invades South Korea in 1950. In response to the North Korean invasion, the United States convinces the United Nations to back an intervention in order to support South Korea. The United States leads a counter-invasion of North Korea, intending to unify the country under capitalist government. The United States pushes the North Koreans all the way back to the Chinese border, but at that point, Chinese troops invade Korea and are able to push U.S. troops back. While this is going on, the Soviet Union provides medical and material assistance to North Korea. Most notably, they provide a number of fighter jets that allow North Korean forces to compete with U.S. forces in the air. It's important to note that the USSR never becomes an official combatant in the war, which is important because that would have meant that the United States and the USSR would have been fighting directly, which could have led to an escalation of the conflict. So from 1950 to 1953, the conflict is indecisive and it's kind of a back and forth battle. Neither side can win a decisive victory, so in 1953 they sign an armistice, which more or less just restores the original border. So it seems like kind of a pointless conflict towards the end because nothing is really resolved. But it's important because it's the first proxy war between the USA and the USSR, and it results in an increasing division between the USA and the USSR. So the Cold War was going on before this, but it becomes more intense as a result of the Korean War. For your goals again, thanks for listening, and I will see you all tomorrow.